So we've talked about the shocks of 1949, and now we have to move on to the Korean War. So it following the shocks of 1949, the United States is going to respond to this heightened threat by increasing our, how should I say, our presence, our military. So here we have this document called NSC 68, and it's published in 1949. It's sort of like a secret document for the United States, but in it what's important here is what is inside of this document is sort of like this new policy approach to dealing with the Soviet Union. So the idea behind NSC 68 is to prevent other countries from falling to communism. And the only way that they can do this is with sort of like a new level of containment. It's almost like they realize that, or they've come to the conclusion that the containment that they were doing before is not enough, right? I mean, the Soviets have developed a bomb, China has fallen to communism, and worst of all, there are spies actively working against us, and they're working within the U.S. government. So our previous level of containment is not enough. It's not sufficient. And so this NSC 68 is essentially promoting the idea that we have to eliminate any kind of opposition with any means necessary. Okay, so how are we going to do this? Well, NSC 68 proposes that the U.S. increase its defense spending. And so to give you an idea of what that looks like, you go from $13.5 to $48.2 billion. And you know, that gets you a lot of military, a lot of people working overtime, if not, 24 hours a day on this. All of a sudden, remember that, with the creation of the Department of Defense, it's no longer like just doing this during wartime. Now it's going to be a full-time gig. And because the communist threat is so huge, it's going to require a huge budget. Okay. Now, in addition to the increased national spending on defense, we are also going to begin researching the hydrogen bomb. So, of course, this is a response to the Soviets acquiring an atomic bomb of their own. The hydrogen bomb, it's perceived that it is going to, the idea is that it's going to diminish that Soviet threat a bit, if possible. And of course, how long does it take the Soviets to develop a hydrogen bomb? I mean, they do it within a year. So it's almost like, it's like a fever pitch here. So we have the atomic bomb, the Soviets develop it in 4 years. They do it with spies. Well, what's going to be our response to that? Well, we'll just build a bigger, stronger bomb, the hydrogen bomb in this case. And then, to nobody's surprise, the Soviets are able to match what the U.S. does in this case, and they do it in 1 year. So, again, this is not going to eliminate any fears over spies. If anything, it's just reinforcing that they are actively working. And, again, like I said, this paranoia, this fear, this Cold War mentality is just getting worse and worse. So, NSC 68 is really all about the U.S. Determining that it has to be willing to fight these quote-unquote limited wars in order to compel the enemy, right? So it's about going anywhere and everywhere that it needs to go in order to stop the spread of communism or to eliminate it altogether, okay? And so in class we did that exercise when we talked about Berlin, the Berlin blockade in Germany. We talked about the Korean War. We talked about what's the other one? Oh, Vietnam. And I gave you guys the example of Iran and Guatemala, right? And the three kinds of U.S. involvement here when it comes to these confrontations between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, right? We have hot, which are face-to-face, like U.S. versus Soviet Union, one-on-one. You have cold, which are proxy, like confrontations between the U.S. and the Soviet Union via another country. So it's like us backing the Koreans, the South Koreans, and the communists, the Soviets backing the North Korean faction, the communist faction, and they're fighting it out. We're supporting them. And this is just a continuation of the Cold War mentality. Same thing in Vietnam, right? Where you have the North and Southern Vietnam. And we are backing them and they're backing the North. And again, it's just the same thing. But then we also have covert, right? So we have hot, cold, and covert operations where we are indirectly trying to, or in some cases directly, but it's not out in the open. We're not announcing it, right? But, in order to stop the spread of communism and to promote or to support governments in foreign countries that are U.S. friendly or, democratic. And so what do we do about that? Well, we might influence their elections or we might give them money to support them. And so that our influence, our involvement, I should say, in Iran, in Guatemala is just an extension of this Cold War mentality and the desire to stop the spread of communism. Okay, so NSC 68 is instrumental to this. It's like we're taking containment to a new level. Okay, and so some critics warn that the U.S. is really kind of overreacting. That the Soviets acquiring an atomic bomb. Our response to that, it was just like way too much. We're being really extra. And people are always going to debate whether or not, who is being more reactionary or overreacting. Was it the U.S. or was it the Soviet Union? And there's plenty of blame to go around. But just when that debate was starting to get traction, North Korea invades South Korea. And so suddenly, this communist takeover seemed likely, like it was going to happen, right? Why? Well, because it was happening. It was being manifested in the Korean peninsula. Okay, so what happens here? What is the Korean War all about? Well, remember what happens in Berlin in 1948, right? I mean, after World War II, Germany was occupied by the U.S., France, Britain, and the Soviet Union. It was split up into four, and it was going to be administered, as a coalition. And the idea was that in the future, 1948 to be specific, all four sections would reunite and Germany would be once more. Same thing is happening in Korea, right? So Korea was actually occupied by the Japanese. And since the Japanese lost, Japan is also going to be occupied by the United States. But Korea is going to be occupied by the United States in the south and by the Soviets in the north, okay? So same thing that happened in Berlin in 1948 is going to happen here. The time to reunite these two sides comes in 1948, but they missed the deadline. Okay? There's a lot of tension. There is a lot of confrontation between the two sides. And what happens then is the North basically invades the South. So let me play this video for you. And it is going to sort of simplify what is happening in Korea. But I want you to think of it this way. It's essentially like a tug of war, right? The North invades the South pushes back, and then they end up coming back, and they're just doing this back and forth, and ultimately, it doesn't end. It's still actively going, and hopefully there will be a treaty soon that will end the war, but we're still kind of waiting for them to get organized and have these talks in the future. For now, let me play you this video. And like I said, it's a very simplified version of what the Korean War was about. It is no less brutal than World War I or World War II. It is still this kind of like Cold War confrontation. There will be a lot of casualties, or there was a lot of casualties, I should say. But you need to understand the bare bones, right? Like the basics in this. Why does it happen? How does it all go down? Who invades who? Why does China get involved? Okay. And ultimately, U.S. involvement as well. Okay, so let's play this video and pay close attention to what is happening here.
At the end of the Second World War, and emerging from nearly 4 decades of brutal Japanese occupation, the Korean Peninsula found itself torn between 2 foreign ideologies, from the Soviet Union and the United States. Following Japan's defeat in 1945, the Soviet Union occupied the communist wing of the Korean resistance, all of the land north of the 38th parallel, while the United States occupied Korea south of the line. The communist North was equipped with over 200,000 armed veterans who fought alongside Mao Zedong's Chinese Red Army against the Japanese, and then against Chiang Kai-shek in China's own bloody civil war. Their leader was Kim Il-sung, who saw the United States appointing former Japanese collaborators to top leadership positions in the South. His intent was to unite Korea under one communist ideology. By contrast, the unstable South was ill-equipped to defend itself compared to the battle-seasoned and well-supplied North. From 1945 to 1950, the South, under the leadership of Syngman Rhee, suffered massive civil unrest, often dealing with popular demonstrations with violent police retaliation, employing tactics reminiscent of the Japanese occupation. Following years of cross-border raids and skirmishing along the 38th parallel, Kim Il-sung invaded the South on June 25, 1950, behind a barrage of artillery fire. Syngman Rhee was forced to flee Seoul 2 days later. On the 3rd day of fighting, the South bombed the bridge crossing the Han River and were in full retreat from the North's advance. On the day of the invasion in 1950, the United Nations Security Council in New York roundly condemned North Korea's action, with veto-wielding Russia infamously absent from the session. 2 days later, Security Council Resolution 83 was passed, recommending UN member states assist South Korea militarily. And with that, American President Harry Truman ordered the U.S. Navy and Air Force, based mostly in Japan at the time, into action on behalf of the South. Less than 2 months since the invasion began, Kim Il-sung had driven the South Korean and U.S. forces to Pusan in the southeast corner of the peninsula, and was expecting an imminent and total victory in the war. At the time, China decided to position more than 250,000 of its troops along its Korean border, should the conflict escalate and the North's advance be repelled. After weeks of fighting around Pusan, the U.S. had significantly reinforced the South, while American bombers degraded the supply lines and troop strength of the North. The army of Kim Il-sung was forced to retreat. Only 25,000 North Korean soldiers ever managed to rejoin their northern ranks. The South's counterattack successfully pushed across the 38th parallel and, along with U.S. forces, captured the North Korean capital of Pyongyang. In response, China ordered its troops to cross into North Korea and repel the South Korean counteroffensive on October 25, 1950. Following 2 months of brutally contested warfare, U.S. and South Korean forces were expelled from North Korea back across the 38th parallel. By January 4, 1951, North Korea had captured Seoul for a second time. However, as before following its invasion of the South in June 1950, North Korea lacked the logistical support to supply any further pursuit of the South. This gave U.S. and South Korean troops time to quickly regroup, rearm, and retake Seoul. After 6 weeks of back-and-forth fighting, the U.S. launched a full-scale assault against the North Korean and Chinese forces in February 1951. For the rest of the year, fighting continued around the 38th parallel, steadily degrading into World War I-style trench warfare, brutal and mechanical. As casualties mounted on both sides, efforts at negotiating a ceasefire grew. However, several attempts at diplomacy were thwarted throughout 1952 and into 1953. With Korean civilian casualties approaching 3 million, a proposal was finally accepted by the United Nations, and an armistice agreement was signed on July 27, 1953. The result led the embittered North and South Koreans to create a demilitarized zone roughly along the 38th parallel, which has perpetuated the hostility of the two countries for 6 decades and counting.
Okay, so the 38th parallel is where, it's like the border between the two countries. And so, just to kind of like wrap it up, right, in 1950, that's really kind of where the the invasion begins with North Korea invading South Korea. They make it all the way to the capital of Seoul, where then they are going to push back the North Korean army, led by General Douglas MacArthur. You remember him from World War II. And as well as think back to the bonus army, right? He's the one that gave the order to move on the encampment for the bonus army protesters that were in Washington, D.C. So MacArthur is going to push the North Korean all the way back. And here is where things get tricky, because they are able to push back all the way to the border with China. Now, China got nervous by this, thinking that they were going to invade, and of course they weren't. Truman had told them not to, but nevertheless, China is going to get involved. They're going to now join the North Korean army, push them back all the way across the 38th parallel and back towards the capital city. Again, like I said, or like the video said, it is going to bog down. There is going to be intense fighting. It is really kind of like this back and forth. There's an armistice. A stalemate. The armistice comes in 1953. But the stalemate results in MacArthur becoming increasingly frustrated with President Truman at his lack of decisiveness, at his lack of unwillingness to really pursue the Korean army. So he is going to criticize the president to the media, and eventually what happens is MacArthur gets fired. He gets sacked, and for insubordination, right? So he's not following orders. He's disobeying the president, and so he gets fired and removed of his duty. Now, that stalemate, that the kind of fighting, really bogged down trench warfare, we're back in World War I, is going to continue until 1953, when both sides reach an armistice, right? And remember what an armistice means. It essentially just means a ceasefire. There is no, the war doesn't end. They just essentially stopped shooting at each other, and a demilitarized zone, a DMZ, is going to be established at the 38th parallel. Let me just remind you where that is. Right here, right? 38th. You see the 38th parallel right there? That's the border. That's where Korea is divided now. Okay. So remember, Korean War continues on and on. We're still working on some kind of an official treaty to end that. And so that's really it. Make sure that you know how it gets started, who's involved, why MacArthur gets sacked, why China gets involved, and all the years and everything that go along with understanding and breaking down the Korean War. Okay, we're gonna stop it for there. We're gonna stop it there for now, and we're gonna continue this lecture on the next part 8. Okay.